everybody. If you don't know, my name is Tim Dolahanty. I'm the county administrator. We're focusing tonight on the Open Meetings Act, and Matt Nordfjord from Cohl, Stoker, and Toskey, county's law firm, will do that presentation. I've handed out, or you've picked up at the back of the room, a copy of the county's standards of conduct policy that was recently adopted. We're not going to go over that tonight, but we do want to make sure that this is in the hands of all of our appointed boards and commissions. Most of it is common sense. You're going to read through this and you're going to realize, yeah, if I have a conflict of interest, if I've sold a piece of land to a developer and I'm on the planning commission and he has something in front of us to pass, that I probably should just step out and not participate. So just things like that, just good reminders and good tips. But please read those over. If you have questions, you can contact me or wait till your next meeting. You can post the questions to your staff person and we'll get them back to me. But one way or another, we'll get those questions answered. And that will relieve us of a terrible ending to tonight if I was to go through that piece by piece. So please review it on your own, and it'll, like I said, probably be just review for you. I think nothing that you'll find very surprising. So with that, our target audience tonight was our appointed boards and commissions, along with our board of commissioners. We have two commissioners with us tonight, Brenda Simmons and Craig Scott. We have, I see a few staff people here as well, and we have a number of people on Zoom, and of course we can't see them, we don't know who they are, so they're at the advantage. But as Matt said, I think go ahead and ask questions as they come up, and with that, Matt, it's all yours.
All right, great. Thanks, Tim.
Technology works.
So I'll break the ice by giving you a little bit of personal info about me. I was born in West Branch. My parents lived here back in 1979 to 1981. My dad was a very newly minted CPA. My mom is a speech pathologist. She was working in Clare and running back and forth. The hospital they used was actually Cadillac. So I have a bond affinity. They kept friends here. We would come and visit. So I know your area. I've only been representing Ogemaw County for a year and a quarter. So we're plugging right along, but I've known the county administrator for quite some time. And it's been a real pleasure getting to know the ins and outs of Ogemaw County. I lecture on the Open Meetings Act around the state. I can do that here tonight. I promise you I can fill the time and cover the material. If you've gone to any trainings or anything like that through MSU Extension, all this is recorded, it's there. I think the way that I would like to offer this, and you don't have to take me up on it, I won't embarrass anybody by calling you out, but I find these to be so productive if you pose questions to me, whether they're in hypothetical form, things that you have experienced, things that you just want clarification on. You can interrupt me, we can start there. However you want to proceed with the questions, just know that I'm not on any kind of time clock or agenda. I will circulate this information to Tim. Basically, he's now got my PowerPoint. I find PowerPoints to be useful to keep me moving through in the right order, but I also find them to be distracting if you're reading what's on there. So I kind of go off script of the PowerPoint, but just know we can send you that. Our firm produces a summary of the Open Meetings Act. This isn't anything magical. It's just something that we've developed over time. I'm going to send these up and you'll have that as well. This is not designed for you to become an expert in the Open Meetings Act. I deal with this almost daily, and I still am going back and referring to the act. Things are changing. I really just want you to have broad stroke understanding so that you feel comfortable asking questions if you think something isn't happening with the act. This is an area that, I mean, I would characterize it as a trap for the unaware, and it can basically get you sideways with constituents. Even law enforcement, there are misdemeanor and civil penalties for intentional violations of the Open Meetings Act. I'll go through and tell you how to fix things. A lot of things can be remedied before they get that way through a process called reenactment. And that's not prejudicial. Even if you're being sued, you can go back and fix the decision at a later meeting. And then there's our new marker point. So there's ways to work through this. It's one of these things that I think is something everybody on a public body needs to understand. That's sort of the big picture part. I believe, just by a show of hands, everybody in here serves on a public body that's subject to the Open Meetings Act. Is that affirmative? Okay. And it's often a very simple starting point to say, look, my public body is subject to the OMA. It can get confusing if you have committees and subcommittees and whether or not they're subject to the Open Meetings Act. And all I can tell you is that it depends. And it depends what you've delegated to those committees or subcommittees, what they're doing. if they're literally taking information and giving all of it to the public body, they may be purely advisory. But if they're taking 6 things and narrowing it down to 3 things that are the responsibility of the public body, and you don't see those 3 things, they're probably subject to the Open Meetings Act. So it's stuff like that that is just, I mean, I understand this is the law, this is what keeps me employed, but it's a case-by-case basis on a lot of these things on how to navigate it. So I just hope that when you have something that you're not certain about, that you just ask that question. We're here as a resource for you. I get phone calls from people all the time. It often doesn't take me too long to answer their question because I've answered it probably 50 times before, but it may be something that's new to you, and that's what we're here for. So that's the background. I'll pause, take a breath. Does anybody want to start with anything before I launch into the presentation? Yes, sir.
Your opening statement about you and him knowing, does that produce conflict?
No. So I think it's a distinct advantage that we've known each other professionally for a long time. But that's good. I like that. Anyone else? Open Meetings Act related, but conflicts are fine. We can talk about FOIA conflicts, whatever you want.
The standards of conduct,
Yeah.
does that apply to the townships too?
So standards of conduct are county issued. Tim can talk a little bit about that if you'd like, but go ahead. I'll stop talking because they're yours.
Yeah, it's strictly a county policy. We apply it to everybody that has any kind of association with the county, but it doesn't go beyond that. So if it's a township, the city of West Branch doesn't apply there. It'd be a good idea if they were to adopt it, but that's completely up to them.
So they write their own constitution then, basically?
Their own standards of conduct, yeah.
And not everybody has such a robust standards of conduct model. So I think that if you don't have one, that's a good template. I think it's really important. You know, there's only a couple of things that are legally prohibited conflicts of interest. That is basically if you have a contract with a public body that you serve on and you get a financial benefit, or if you have an incompatible public office. And if your spouse is contracting, you may not have a conflict. So there's not a lot that's like strictly a conflict, but there's many things that are sort of ethically ambiguous or could be problematic. And that's why I think these standards of conduct policies are so important. And a lot of them are just sort of developed through the School of Hard Knocks, where you learn something about not disclosing, even though you're maybe not legally required to. And people are wondering if things are on the up and up. So that's why it's a good idea to have those. And that's a little bit of an aside from the Open Meetings Act, but good question.
Another just let you know what drove us to do this. We are recipients of grants from USDA and CDBG. Those are federal grants, and they're now requiring us to have these. So it's really nice for me to be able to say, yes, I have one, and here it is, and they can look at it and make sure it's everything up the standard that they want. So that was really the driving issue. But as Matt said, good idea to have it anyway.
Anything else? All right. So Open Meetings Act has been around since 1976. Before that, it was the typical smoky cigar-filled back room where business was being done out of the eyes of the public. The whole purpose of this act was to encourage and facilitate transparency and governance. That's really it in a nutshell. And it's making sure that people know when you're having a meeting, what you're talking about at the meeting, because they have public access and the ability for them to comment at the meeting. That's 5 pages long, and it can, come at you in a number of different ways. Board secretaries, clerks, those folks are really looking at the minutes. But I want to just say briefly about minutes. All that's required legally to be in minutes is the date of the meeting, the public body, members of the public body, and what votes and motions were made. It doesn't have to be a verbatim recitation of what transpired at the meeting, but that's really up to you procedurally as a body and what you're used to. I will say, and I put this on my first page of my handwritten notes, if you're uncomfortable with something and you're there, challenge the status quo. Things have been happening around meetings forever. And I don't know, maybe a show of hands if you're within the last 2 years a new member to a public body. So everybody's got a little more historic experience in 2 years or 2 years or less. New people are a huge advantage because they often question the status quo. And I think it's important, no matter how long you've been on there, if you feel like something isn't happening in a way that is consistent with what you're going to hear tonight, we don't have to flame each other, but ask the question, get a resource, get going on that, because really the whole point of all this in education and training that I think is most valuable is saving you a problem. I'm not going to be able to fix things that have been going on for 30 years, but maybe I can stop that thing from getting you in trouble if somebody hasn't been paying attention and then all of a sudden you're just in it. And so that's what I think the big advantage of people coming in and questioning the status quo on things like open meetings.
I have a question.
Yeah.
If we do our minutes and they do disclose certain, I mean, more than what you said, I mean, there's a topic that comes up and so-and-so said this and there's comments about it. Is that a good thing, or should we be careful that if something's not in there that's and the public member comes back later on and says, wait a minute, that's not even in there and you intentionally left something out, it's that nature.
Well, that happens. I mean, they're your minutes. I think whatever you're comfortable with. I certainly see is because, you know, at the county level, the county's got a pretty formalized process for board action where there are written resolutions or written motions and things like that. Not every public body works like that. A lot of public bodies will have just sort of loose topics, and then as they're discussed, people will craft and create motions. So oftentimes, to understand the context of what went on, it's really good to have that, let's call it more verbatim thing in the minutes. Nobody can sue you for not including something in your minutes. They're the body's minutes. And those minutes, there's timing and there's things like that, but once they're approved, and they're supposed to be approved at the next regular meeting of the public body, that's it. They're your record. Review them. I mean, you should. I sit on a public body, the Ogemaw County Building Authority. I read every single set of minutes because we can correct them. And if there's things in there that are maybe more expansive than I wanted them to be, or maybe not accurate, we go through and we edit them. You know, somebody can make an amendment, request that they be edited. And then once they're approved, they're there. They're a permanent record of what the board action was at that point in time. And I don't have any issue with there being a lot of detail or a little detail. I think that if somebody is really curious about what went on, the minutes are always going to just show part of the story, probably.
Okay, and as far as that goes, from one meeting to the next, you're gonna have detail on one and not the other. It doesn't
Sure.
matter.
Doesn't matter. I think that, you know, if you have the same person keeping the minutes each time, they'll probably be pretty consistent, but there might be public bodies that are rotating who's keeping the minutes, and stylistically, there's no, you know, other than the bare minimum that is legally required, there's no hard and fast rules about the minutes. Okay, yeah. So I talked about the purpose, been around for 45 years, and in the last 2 years, it's been amended twice. And both of those amendments caused a lot of change within the way people were operating. During the pandemic, we allowed virtual meetings for the first time. That was pretty exciting. I'd never attended a meeting virtually. Probably most of you had never attended meetings virtually, because that really didn't happen in state government because we couldn't do that. The law, as we interpreted it prior to those amendments, was that you had to have a quorum physically present at your meeting in order to conduct it. Quorum is not legally defined in the law. Keep this going for people on Zoom, but generally a quorum is a majority of those appointed or elected and serving on a public body. So if you have a public body of 5, a quorum is 3, you can conduct business with 3. But for a county, and this is different for probably each of your entities, and you need to look at your board rules, a county to do final action on something has to have a majority of members elected and serving. So if there's 3 people at the meeting, it can be called to order, it can be adjourned, and that could go 2-1. But if they want to pass anything, it's got to be 3-0. So that's a distinction that's important about counties and quorum that's in statute. Just know your bylaws, know what your quorum requirements are, because a lot of public bodies operate on a majority of the quorum present. And so, and that's hypothetical I was giving. If you've got 3, you just need 2 to pass things. And that's perfectly fine and perfectly legal. Should be in your bylaws or articles of incorporation. This thing time out on me, Tim?
So if one person out of the 3 doesn't agree or won't pass it, then it's not passed.
Well, it depends. I mean, what public body are you on?
I'm a county commissioner.
Yeah, that's the answer. I'm sorry, I recognize you. So
But you might
it's so funny out of context because I attend most of their meetings on Zoom. So it's so I recognize your voice and everything. I apologize. And so it's one of those things where if it's a final measure, then yes, it is 3-0 in order if you only have 3 there. That's a great point. So
good to know.
yep. But if it's anything procedural, so if somebody challenges a procedural something or a point of order that isn't a final action, that could go 2-1. So it's really an interesting dynamic there. So it's important to know what it is in order for me to give you that answer on the vote. Well, at some point we'll catch up on the slides, but that's okay. So we all know that the act applies to you. The subcommittee is a big source of issues. And I would just tell you that if you've got a standing committee, let's say you have a finance committee, that should probably be subject to the Open Meetings Act. Even if, let's say, your public body's 5, and you're only putting 3 people on a committee, then those subcommittees should still be posting, having public comment and following the Open Meetings Act if they're doing what I'll call a governmental function by narrowing things down for the public body. Does anybody have any questions on quorum? Yes.
So that you're saying then, if you had a board of commissioners that's 5, 3 can meet at one time. Because you can't pass anything that's permanent unless you have a quorum.
Well, 3 is a quorum.
I know, but I mean 3 that yes votes to pass something.
So say that to me one more
Can
time.
you have a meeting with 3 county commissioners at one time?
If you're deliberating towards decisions on county business, you would be a quorum having a meeting outside of the Open Meetings Act. So the answer to that question is no.
So you can't do that?
No.
Okay,
If you're in a committee and it's 3 of you, that committee should also be posted under the Open Meetings Act if you're performing a function of the public body. And by function, I mean literally, let's say you got a facilities committee meeting. It gets tricky when it's only 3, because a quorum of 3 is 2. So if I'm telling you, you can't have a quorum discussing business outside of an open meeting, that gets a little complicated, but I'm going to throw another wrench into it, which is the Open Meetings Act always allows one-on-one communication. So no matter what, even if your quorum is 2 and there's 3 of you on the public body, you can have one-on-one communications. That's been tested. It's been upheld upright, left and center to allow one-on-one communication. Yes.
You had touched on the fact earlier that during COVID, Zoom was allowed. Did that revert?
Yes. Yeah. So after starting January of last year, the only basis that you could have for a virtual attendee to vote and be counted towards a quorum was if they're on active military duty. And it's a little nuanced right now, because my advice that I give to clients is that if the board wants to permit a member to comment or be in a closed session or not vote but be part of the meeting, then that to me is permissible, because they are not violating the law by counting towards a quorum or voting. So if somebody's out of town and they want to provide you some feedback on an issue, and the chair and the rest of the public body, because you could overrule the decision of the chair, permits that, I have no issue with that. And so that's more strict than it used to be. Before, a lot of public bodies had the rule that as long as we had a quorum physically present, and some of these like regional mental health board or something, there's 16 people on that board. So if their quorum was 9, the rest of those people could have been on a speakerphone and voted before these recent amendments came through the Open Meetings Act. So the legislature right now is trying to work out a deal to at least get it back to the way it was, because it's pretty cumbersome if you're up in the UP and you got a 3-county health department, and these counties are, 120 miles in the snow to get to a meeting that lasts 15 minutes long. It's a big deal. And so I think that'll come back around, but right now it's just for active military duty. And a lot of board rules need to change, because so many of them used to permit, even if it wasn't truly virtual, because I mean, I don't know, not too many places were using Zoom prior to the pandemic, but a lot of places were using conference phones, and that was totally fine. And now it's not. So it's something to be aware of. And if your public body doesn't follow this super closely, because it's not that common unless you're doing it for a living, these are things that you should be aware of if you're having people call into your meetings and their votes are counting and they're being counted as a member present toward a quorum.
so
All right, say you have a 5-member board and 3 people run into each other at a coffee shop.
Yep.
Does it make a difference if they're talking just 3 together, just happen to run into each other, if they're talking about the weather? Or does it make a difference if they're talking about business that did come up?
It makes a huge difference. So the Open Meeting Act only applies to members of a public body who are deliberating toward a decision on a matter of policy or business of your entity. So a training, right now, we're not in a posted meeting. I don't know if I have a quorum. You don't need to. We're not conducting any business of your public body. It's just us discussing, the ins and outs of the Open Meetings Act. You're in a community where you probably have breakfast with people that you serve on other public bodies with. But I will tell you, anecdotally, that if you have, let's say, 3 out of 5 or 5 out of 5 at the diner, you may cause people to question if there's business being discussed about the county. And as long as you're not, no problem, that's defensible, not an issue, but I am aware of places, not here, where they used to have the pre-meeting down at the diner, and then they do the votes in about 3 seconds at the actual open meeting in the boardroom. So that type of thing, the law does not allow, but it's a question of really you policing yourself. 9 times out of 10, a member of the public isn't going to know if it was only 2 of you talking or 3 of you talking on my 5-member board example. But what's really dynamically changed is how much communication is happening electronically now. So if you're emailing with each other and you get an email from your county administrator and you hit reply all saying, I don't want to do that, that's probably okay. But the next commissioner in my hypothetical who says, well, I do, now I've started to build a chain of a potential Open Meetings Act violation. And here's the key, that's subject to FOIA. So there are exemptions to FOIA, but that's how a lot of these things are getting found out. And so people will do a public records request for any and all communications from XYZ public body for this period of time. If those communications are produced, then there it is. It's right there in black and white. It's not too hard to count on your fingers how many people are hitting reply on an email. So we caution against that. My advice on how to deal with that is you reply to the sender. Don't hit reply all. A lot of places you'll see blind copying everybody. So you won't actually, you'll see maybe just your name and then it'll say whatever the public body. And that way that prevents against reply all. That's a little more sophisticated than a lot of places operate, which is fine. Just know that you can be deliberating on your personal cell phone, texting, on your personal email, on your official email, on really any realm of communication that's happening could potentially subject you to a violation or FOIA is the starting point. And then, or somebody just gets a hold of the email. A lot of times you've got, I get emails for a client of mine where there's 90 people on this email, including every commissioner. And so it could be right there for everybody to see if they're not properly trained to know, how to handle that if they've got a question or a comment. And questions usually aren't a big deal. The Open Meetings Act is a bar against deliberative discussions. A question isn't necessarily a deliberation. A deliberation is, I think we should do this and here's why. That's step 1. And then step 2 is somebody saying, I disagree, we should do it a different way, or I agree, it doesn't really matter. All of a sudden now you're deliberating, and depending on what the topic is, it could be subject to this law.
I have one more question to make sure I didn't. So in a meeting right now, you must be present to vote. You can't do it via Zoom.
That's correct.
Okay,
Yep. I think that'll change in the next 90 days.
really?
Yeah.
That's not good.
So stay tuned. All right, so we covered application. So here's what I was talking about deliberating, not statutorily defined. So deliberating, basically what we do as lawyers is we look to the law and we hope that there's a definition. And if there's not a definition, we apply our best guess. So we are just basically taking the dictionary definition for deliberating, which is the act of carefully considering issues and options before making a decision or taking some action, or discussing, which in turn is defined as the act of exchanging views on something. So it's pretty low bar on what you could be discussing if it has to deal with your public body. Decision, determination, action, vote, or disposition on a motion. And then to determine whether or not the Open Meetings Act applies, one must take into consideration the definitions of a meeting. That's the first step. What's a meeting? A meeting is, I already told you, one-on-one is fine no matter what. A meeting is whether or not you have people that constitute a quorum of your public body. There's also something that's prohibited by the law called round robin. And that's, let's say you had a 7-member body and you had 2 people going around and talking to 1 or 2 other people. And then all of a sudden they've linked up enough groups that a quorum have basically had the same discussion. It's pretty complicated. It doesn't happen very much where it's being challenged. Just operate under the very simple premise that if you want to know what somebody thinks about something, do it one-on-one. You could talk to every single person on the body. It's a straw poll. There's nothing against that, but it's got to be you picking up the phone. That's my suggestion over email or text. Pick up the phone. Hey, what do you think about this? Here's what I think about it. And the FOIA thing is the reason that I'm recommending you either do that in person or over the phone, because I think it's FOIA is great, but I also think FOIA has really limited the ability for people to be candid. I don't write an email anymore unless I would want my grandma to read it. Like there's nothing hot going in an email, period. Because and I'm a lawyer, all my stuff is privileged. So you've got attorney-client privilege when you're communicating with me. It's not coming out of my mouth, but that's still how I operate. And you don't have that. You don't have privilege. I mean, you guys do have an exemption under FOIA for things that are deliberative prior to making a final determination. Very few places get too far with that exemption because it's usually sort of the first tipping point to making the decision if the decision was made. The law allows people under FOIA to get their legal fees. There's an appeal process. It's one of those things where I just don't want you in that dance if I can keep you out of it. And you still can figure out what people want to do. I mean, I wouldn't want to be on a public body bringing things forward out of the blue, not knowing if I had support or not. That's why the law allows that one-on-one communication outside of the meetings. So talking one-on-one, that is not a meeting. 3 of you out of 5 talking about county business, that could be a meeting, depending on what you're covering. The deliberating and the decision are as stated above. I already mentioned the seminars, trainings, talking about your families, the weather. Even if all of you are together, that's not a deliberation or discussion that's covered by the act. There's the meeting informally. It's really not permitted if you're discussing county business. There's an AG opinion on that. It doesn't have to be declared as a meeting. It can be a random encounter. All of a sudden you're at, VFW barbecue and you're talking about somebody that, issues in, I'm going to pick on the clerk's office, issues in the clerk's office and budget's coming up and you want to do something. Proceed with caution. People are around, people are listening. It's not really to me even about getting caught. It's just knowing that those types of things the law expects you to do at an open meeting. I kind of jumped around. I covered email and texting. Under FOIA, a public record includes email, text, social media posts, voicemails. That's a tough lesson to learn. Your voicemails are public records if they're covering county business. If your personal voicemails are not. So if you're asking your spouse, what are we having for dinner on a voicemail, that's not getting disclosed. If you're leaving a voicemail for somebody in your professional world at the public body level, and somebody FOIAs that, and that record is still around and producible, it needs to be produced if it's responsive to the FOIA and there's no exemption. It has to be something that's prepared, owned, used, in possession of, or retained by a public body in the performance of an official function. That's a mouthful, but what that really means is that there isn't, like an informal level of Q&A that you can have about your official capacity that might not be subject to FOIA. If you're talking about it, if you're documenting it, it might be a public record. I can't promise you that it always will or won't be. I mean, FOIA has 13 different exemptions. We use them all the time. But not everybody's claiming exemptions. Exemptions are discretionary. I don't have to say if I get a FOIA request that an exemption applies. I might just produce it. And so just know that that's a possibility. And that's something that really links up a lot with emails, texting. Another thing about emails and texting that I noticed a lot when we went to Zoom is people are doing it during meetings. And I attend a lot of meetings, so I've seen it before, but that could potentially violate the Open Meetings Act if you're texting each other. That's called a meeting within a meeting. And that is not permitted by the act. Everything that you're doing during that meeting should be focused on, a public and transparent process. You can ask, I'm going to pick on Tim, who's at a county board meeting. You guys all sit pretty close together, but if you wanted to text Tim and say, Tim, what's going on with X, Y, or Z? Tim's not a member of the public body. So that's not a problem. But if you are texting your cohort on the board, because that's all this applies to. I mean, it only applies to members of the public body. So if you're texting the person 3 seats down, I think we should vote no on this. And somebody FOIAs your email communication or your text message from that meeting, I'm going to tell you, just reenact the decision at the next meeting and we'll probably be fine. But that's not permitted by the law. And now with everybody, I don't know how many people have it, but I see a lot of iPads and laptops and phones out at meetings all the time. I don't know what people are doing. I don't know if they're posting to Facebook or communicating with each other below the public's view.
So it's okay for a member to text Tim during the meeting, that's legal, that's okay, even if Tim texts him back, they talk about what was happening by that person, is that way, that's okay.
Yeah, Tim's not a member of the public body.
The public body sitting there on the board.
Board members. Yeah, there's a lot of people that sit up there. You know, that's, you could have a clerk sitting there, you could have staff people. I mean, I sit at public meetings, I get rained with texts usually during a public meeting from people. So that's another reason that I know that it's happening. But I'm not a member of the body. And then oftentimes, if I feel it's appropriate, I will interject to answer the question if it's something that everybody should know. And I've watched him do, not with the text, but the same thing, right? Like the idea of having resource people at meetings is for everybody to hear the answer to the question. And that's why 99% of the time, the question is asked verbally and responded to verbally so that everybody in the room can hear it and that everybody on the body knows what the answer is. All right, good there. So we kind of covered this already too. It doesn't apply to social or chance gatherings, doesn't apply to trainings like tonight, conferences or seminars. Right to the public. So the Open Meetings Act is where the right for public comment exists. That's what we turn to in the law. How many people have 2 opportunities for public comment at their board meetings? Just by show of hands. Does anybody know? So the law requires 1. A lot of places have 2, 1 at the beginning, 1 at the end, and I think that's pretty prudent. That way people can comment on something before you're taking action, but there's no agenda requirement in the Open Meetings Act. A lot of people are surprised to hear that. Most public bodies have some form, even if it's very brief, of an agenda, and that may be set out in your bylaws or your articles of incorporation, that here's what every meeting is going to be structured the same way. Even if we don't have business on something, it'll still be maybe just a blank or a line. That's an internal procedure that is not subject to legal challenge. The only thing that really requires notice of what you're going to do is a special meeting. So the special meeting is covered under the Open Meetings Act, 18 hours public notice in a place that's available to the public for the entire 18 hours. You can't put it on an internal wall and then lock the building at 5. But the special meeting notice has to say the purpose of the meeting. It doesn't mean it has to say the agenda, but a special meeting to consider review and approval of something. That's in the meeting notice. Every other regular board meeting could literally say regular board meeting, XYZ public body, this date and time, this location. That's all that's required in those notices. A lot, maybe most, if not all, still post an agenda. And I think that's really good because that way people know and don't just have to randomly show up to meetings that may not have anything to do with what they're doing. But, you know, that's just a distinction, something that I think 99% of the people think the law requires an agenda. I think that's probably a good default position, but it's not in the act itself. Public access includes the right to tape record, video, a meeting. So you can't kick somebody out of a meeting if they set up a tripod in the back and roll a videotape. People can be removed from meetings for being disruptive. So if they come up and they are shoving a microphone in your face and being aggressive and bothersome, and they've been warned, I always like to give a warning, sir, you need to sit down. You're welcome to record, but you can't disrupt the meeting. People can be removed for breaching the peace. That's pretty rare. I pretty much encourage the venting, the airing of grievances. Any Seinfeld fans here? So the airing of grievances, I think, is a really important process for public comment. And if your public comment, you should have rules. They're in your bylaws or your articles that say public comments limited to, 3 minutes or whatever it is. I don't necessarily want you to be like super strict about it because that can alienate people that you represent. But I think saying what the rules are at the start of every public comment and generally adhering to the rules keeps the thing moving along. If you have a controversial topic, and hopefully you're doing public comment at the beginning, even though there's nothing that says when it has to happen. But if you really want to make a bunch of people angry, vote on something they were there to talk to you about and then have them comment afterward. That's a disaster. I've been at those meetings. I've been in some really hot township meetings where I had 250 people public commenting. You don't have to stay there all night. It's not a marathon, but if public comment's not done, you can't cut it off. So if your board rules allow for 3 minutes for every person, maybe it says you can't, combine time. So 20 people can't say, well, I'm giving it all to our lawyer. because we'll talk the whole time if we're given the opportunity, is that you have a situation on your hands where you have to get through that part of the agenda before you can move on. And you just have to sometimes deal with it. And you can recess and reconvene. That's how you deal with it. If it goes on for 6 hours and it seems to not be stopping, there's no requirement for you to spend the night in your board chambers so you can get all the public comment. But all the public comment on an issue needs to be heard before you move on to the next thing on the agenda. And that's why it's a pretty good idea if you got a bunch of people in particular, but I think even if you only have one or two, to stick to the same rules, apply the same rules to everybody. Public comment should be a one-way conversation. So I'll stop. Did you have a question?
Whenever you're ready.
I'm ready.
Public comment, to have it before, what do I know to say if I don't know what's going on? When it's at the end, it's already been approved and done, so it really doesn't mean anything.
A lot of people do it both. So a lot of boards will have an opportunity at the beginning, and sometimes they'll say, this is your opportunity to comment on things that are on the agenda, even though you can add something to the agenda after public comment. There's nothing that says you're locked in to what is on your agenda. I told you already, there's no agenda requirement, but it gives people the opportunity, if you have an agenda, to comment on the thing before they vote. And then the reason I like it twice, and they don't have to even be the same length. You could have the first one be 3 minutes and say, look, we'd like this to be on agenda topics. And then we'll have, if you want to talk about the moon phases at the end of the meeting, go ahead, you get 2 minutes then. But I think it's a good thing to allow an opportunity for public comment at the beginning and the end of the meeting.
Well, at the end, public comment, I can just express my dislike about something, but it's already been approved, so.
It is, but maybe at the next meeting, somebody makes a motion for reconsideration because they heard something they didn't know. So I've been in a lot of situations where I've seen public comment change the outcome on something. And I've seen that happen before and after. So I think even if that's rare, I think, I have the unfair advantage of going to 200 board meetings a year. I don't know how many you go to. So I've probably seen it all when it comes to a public comment situation. And the ones that are run properly give people the chance. They're relatively strict and they keep people focused on, the chair. It does not turn into a back and forth. It is not a Q&A. If you say to somebody, if they're asking questions, look, we'll try to follow up with you afterwards or refer them to a resource person or something like that. But public comment is not back and forth. Public comment is this individual's opportunity to exercise their First Amendment right with some reasonable rules that your public body has to tell you what they think. And, it's not.
Question for you. You get in our public comment part of our meeting. We've had some pretty heated ones, and if there's 15 people got public comment, they're all got the same complaint. It's the same issue. They're saying, they don't want it there, they don't want it there, they don't want it there. And as the chairman of the board, can he ask, is there any new questions to be asked instead of the same repetitive statement from the public?
You could, but you can't stop people from coming up and, they could read a prepared statement to you 15 times in a row. So that's their right to petition the government. You can't cut it off even if you're hearing the same thing over and over again. And your point is interesting because I've actually seen that where people are basically trying to disrupt the ability for the body to do their business at hand. And there can be a concerted effort if there's a controversial topic to say, all right, well, we're going to more or less filibuster this by having 4 hours of public comment where, I've seen it to so extreme where people are reading scripts from The Office or something. So it can really gum up the works. But I will tell you from a, I don't want you to be sued standpoint, let it go. Most of these things, these controversies, these issues do not get solved by cutting off public comment. And it usually has the reverse effect of making it worse. I said about the airing of the grievances, I think it's cathartic for people, even if they think they're talking to blank stares, to get up and tell you what they think. You may be disinterested. I would encourage you not to turn your backs or get up or leave. But, the chair should keep the thing professional and keep people on topic. Where I see public comment evolve and people get upset is when it turns personal and people start attacking a member of the public body. If you're chairing a meeting and one of either yourself or your colleagues is being attacked, that person should be hammered down and reminded that the comments need to be on county business, not include personal attacks, and get through it. You know, that doesn't mean that you stop them from commenting. If somebody starts swearing or threatening, that's different. You know, if they're dropping a bunch of F-bombs on you and threatening you, they're done. They can be removed from the meeting. But if they're just angry about something, let's take my example. I don't know if you were hearing me talk about roadkill, saying there's all this roadkill all over the place and you need to do something about it. You need to do something about it now. Let them finish and move on to the next one, even if there's 15 people there to talk about roadkill. So keep that going, keep that consistent on the public comment.
And it's not two-way. The board does not have to answer a question.
Right.
It is comment only.
Right.
If they have a question that may not get answered.
That's right. And I would set that up at the beginning when you're talking about public comment, say a little thing about it. It doesn't have to be formal. I see some places where the clerk or the board chair will read what the rules are about public comment. You don't have to be that formal, but I think if you manage expectations, because some people ask you a question, they'll just stop. And so that can be weird. Just say, we don't answer questions during public comment. It's your opportunity to address us and keep it one direction. That's my advice. I mean, I've been to so many of these. I see tons of them where it gets back and forth. And sometimes the back and forth is good and sometimes it's not. So my advice would be keep it the same for everybody, which is just maintain the expectation that it's a one-way street. And, you know, at the end of their comment, you could say, you know, well, if you want to give your contact information to the clerk, we'll try to get a response to you. You know, if they're asking, who do I go to for Veterans Affairs benefits? That's probably something you can answer on the fly or give them direction to. I mean, I don't want you to be unresponsive. I just don't want it to turn into, why didn't you do this? Or why didn't you vote that way? Because it's not an inquisition, it's public comment. And that's a really important distinction. And I think just good governance is to operate your board in that way, where who's ever running the meeting directs people's attention back to the task at hand of public comment. And people will come there to berate you. I mean, there's no doubt that that is a motive. And I think in my experience, when I see a successful de-escalation, it's because the person gets called out and they lose a lot of momentum when they're told, hey, that's not tolerated. You need to direct your comments to me. And I'm speaking as the chair of that committee. And then once you're done, you need to sit back down. And people, you'd be surprised. You can knock the wind out of somebody's sails pretty quick when they realize that their behavior is not going to be tolerated without having to take what is really an unusual and somewhat extreme step of removing them from a meeting. The only times I see people removed from meetings, in my experience, is if they don't stop, where they're just railing away and their time is up and it's getting aggressive to the point where they won't listen, or if there's some sort of threat or just, you know, on the Zoom thing, you're getting pretty obscene stuff. And so we just click off on the Zoom thing. And I really didn't have any heartburn over that at all. Somebody started broadcasting something appropriate. Okay. So the Open Meetings Act also covers conditions of attendance. You can't make people register just to sit in the audience and listen to you at a meeting. So a lot of boards have a sign-up sheet. That's fine. You can keep that up there. You can require people to give their name and address before they public comment. But if they put John Doe and Nunya on their public comment form, then that's okay. That's the record. I wouldn't make a big deal out of it. I mean, you can weigh their comments however you feel, but there's no requirement that people be, you know, let's just take an Ogemaw County example. I don't have to be from Ogemaw County to come and comment on an Ogemaw County board meeting. If I don't want you to know where I'm from, you know, you can view that through the lens of maybe this isn't a very serious person, or this is somebody who just wants to come and try to stir things up, or whatever it is. I mean, that's fine, but you can have people identify who they are, public comment. I just wouldn't get hung up on, you know, if somebody's saying, no, thank you. All right, anonymous, move on. And then I talked about removal. The law says breach of peace actually committed at the meeting. That's the standard for removing people who are unruly disruptive. I give them a leash usually. If somebody's there, I would warn them, you know, sir, calm down. This is a business meeting. It sounds sort of childish, but I just think that if people are reminded of what they are and where they are and what's going on here, Maybe the way they conduct themselves outside of the meeting is a little different than what they're used to, whatever your standards are. I think that you set the tone. I mean, it's your meeting. You can always recess the meeting if things get out of hand. The chair can just, without objection, we're going to recess and then get up and walk out. If the person calms down or they don't come down, come back in. You can recess to another date. There's a lot of options to deal with things that come up in a meeting. Don't get flustered. I would not overreact, but just know you don't have to sit there and be berated without having some sort of opportunity to get that person under control.
Excuse me.
So say that happens and you recess, the board walks out, they can't talk about what they're gonna do, right? They have to come back in before they discuss.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, if you recess, I take the opportunity to have a break, use the bathroom, get some water. If you're talking in little groups, that's not the end of the world, but I would just avoid it because you got a lot of eyes on you potentially at that point in time. And then let things de-escalate and come back in.
Of course.
Yes.
That go, berating people, does that go back both sides? The commissioners berating somebody, does that, can?
Well, I mean,
The
if
former, the chair, board chair, can she recess that meeting right at that point?
sure, the chair can be overruled by the majority of the board, but anybody on a board could raise a point of order or a point of, decorum, if that's happening. And that's a good way to sort of reset somebody's attention to something that's going on. But if the person continues, then a recess is possible. But
What did you
it's
say you could do before that?
point of order or point of decorum.
Okay,
These are all Robert's rules things. I don't want you to get hung up on. Robert's rules is a guide to orderly meetings. It's
Right.
not the law. You can't be sued for not following Robert's rules of order. But you'll see some boards are very strict with, Madam Chair, point of order. Otherwise, just raise your hand. I don't think that this line of discussion is productive. It doesn't have to be super formal, but the chair then gets to rule on points of parliamentary procedure, which includes conduct of the membership. And if the board doesn't like the ruling of the chair, I move to challenge the ruling of the chair. The majority rules. Chairs are not kings, queens, or dictators of a board. It's all about the majority, but the chair is responsible for sort of initial determinations, I'll call it, on procedural things of that nature. But anybody can raise it.
okay,
And it can be raised at any time. There's no, you don't have to get the floor to raise a point of order. If somebody's going off the rails, you can interject.
just say Madam Chair, point of order?
Yep.
Okay, gotcha.
Notice of meetings, we covered that. If your public body has a website, you need to keep that updated and post your minutes, agenda, and meeting schedule. And for media people, they can get a subscription, and members of the public can get a subscription as well. And it gets kind of complicated. I mean, you could literally have to be sending out minutes to somebody by mail if they've requested it under the Open Meetings Act. So I would use the opportunity if you have a website, because that's a heck of a lot easier than dealing with mail subscriptions, which is what we had to do before we had websites.
Do they have to give you an address, self-stamped
they have to
envelope?
they have to
Because all
request
that
it.
postage will be terrific.
Oh, no, they don't have to give you have to pay for the postage. It doesn't happen very often because most people are getting this stuff either by calling,
Got it.
coming in, or
Okay.
looking at the website if you have it, things like that. Agendas, covered the notices. So regular meeting posting requirements, just know that your public body needs to have a regular meeting schedule posted at the beginning of the year. So within 10 days of the first meeting, you need to set out what your meeting schedule is. You don't necessarily have to have every meeting on there because you can always call a special meeting. But if you have a regular, we meet every other Tuesday, that schedule, according to the Open Meetings Act, needs to be approved at the first meeting of the board and published within 10 days of that meeting. I mean, your first meeting of the year might not be till February. You don't have to have a meeting in January if you don't normally to do that. But those are some of the things that the law requires. And the reason is that regular meetings have a little bit more special status than a special meeting. And what basically it is if you're going to change the schedule of a regular meeting, there's a different process and timing than just doing one as a special meeting. And so the work around that from a practical perspective, because sometimes you don't have a quorum. So you cancel a regular meeting because you didn't have enough people to do anything. There's no notice requirement for cancellations. There's only notices for postings when they start. So the morning of, you figure out, let's just run through this hypothetical. On our Tuesday regular meeting, only 2 of the 5 of us are going to be there. So we're going to send out a communication, maybe put it on the county's website, and we'll post it on the door, meeting canceled, whatever, no problem. But you don't want to wait 2 weeks to deal with the business that you needed to deal with that Tuesday. So you could post a special meeting of the board that was going to handle everything that you're going to handle at the regular meeting. Let's call it a special meeting of the Board of Commissioners. And that only requires an 18-hour notice unless your board rules require something longer. So I hope I'm not confusing you with these caveats. A board may say, we don't meet unless everybody had 24 hours notice. That's totally fine, but the law only requires 18. So you got to know what your bylaws say, but let's just keep my hypothetical going. Wednesday morning, we post for a special meeting of I'm just going to keep using the Board of Commissioners as an example, for Thursday at 5. Okay, that's more than 18 hours away, not a problem. Put that on the door, put that somewhere where somebody can see it from outside of the building if the building's locked. Throw it up on the website if you have one, and then you can handle your regular business at something called a special meeting. You know, there's call a special regular meeting, call whatever you want. But if you don't use the term special in the meeting notice, you're going to have to deal with the, I guess, more involved process of changing a schedule of a regular meeting. In the law, I think the law is a little flawed here, because here's what it says. If there's a change in the schedule of a regular meetings of a public body made at a regular meeting, that's required to be posted within 3 days after the meeting at which the change is made. So that means, and it's anticipating you making schedules to future schedule changes at future meetings at a current meeting. But the hypothetical I gave you, if you need to get the business done, you didn't meet the notice requirements to reschedule your regular meeting, because you didn't do it at a meeting and then give the 3 days notice. It's kind of impossible, right? You canceled your meeting. So just know, if you're not following your regular meeting schedule, somebody should have the word special at the top of the notice if it's not your every other Tuesday. Okay.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Excuse me for a minute.
Sure. No problem.
Thank you.
Nobody needs to ask. I appreciate it though. That's nice. We covered all this. No hidden notices. You'd be surprised how many times I hear, well, we posted it on the 2nd floor of the board chambers. Okay, when was the building open? I mean, that doesn't count if somebody can't see it for the entire 18 hours. So I don't know if you have like a little box or, you know, a window at the front door. That's where your meeting notices should be posted. All right, this is a pretty obvious title, but you'd be shocked how often I'm asking, was it posted? If there's no notice, you can't have a meeting. So if you can't show that you posted it either 18 hours prior for a special meeting or that it was approved as part of your regular meeting schedule, don't do it. Don't proceed with whatever you think is so important unless there's an emergency. So if it's a true emergency, there's no notice required. If, let's say, this building lit on fire and you had to deal with it the next day in some way in Ogemaw County, that's not going to have to be posted, because that would meet the criteria for an emergency. The pandemic, you know, I guess we could debate whether or not there were emergency situations there or not, but even during the pandemic, most people were still posting meetings because meeting schedules got weird as special meetings. I didn't have too many clients saying we're doing an emergency meeting, but they could have. And what you do if you don't have a posting is right at the top, this is an emergency meeting under the Open Meetings Act. That's all you got to say, but then you better darn well be able to show what the emergency was. It's not because somebody couldn't make the meeting the night before. It has to be a legitimate emergency. And, you know, all I can tell you is I'll know it when I see it.
When does the 2/3 vote occur for that?
For what?
To have it called an emergency meeting?
So the 2/3 vote is basically, you know, to hold the meeting, you want to confirm verification from 2/3 of the public
So
body.
someone is calling each of the members. Okay.
Yep. And then once you get there, I mean, at the roll call, if somebody objects, that's another opportunity where if they say, look, I don't think this is legitimate, all right, motion for an emergency meeting. And if you don't get the 2/3, you don't go. It's pretty rare to have an emergency. I mean, I can't even count on one hand the number of emergency meetings I'm familiar with of people having. I'll think of only one example, actually. So it's really, really rare. I think that my statement at the top, no notice, no meeting, is the way people should be operating. Yeah, so I hands them back.
Now, if you, for instance, our meetings are here in the annex building.
Mhm.
It cannot be posted at the county building, a special meeting. It has to be at this building.
Well, where are your postings normally?
Well, I don't know. I mean, we don't usually get postings. It's a schedule. But if there's a special meeting, I mean, we used to meet at the county building.
Yep.
Now we meet here. So has it got to be posted in the annex, or would it be on the bulletin board at the county building?
My answer to you would be both, because it should be posted at the place of the meeting, but it should also be where the postings are. Because you don't want to have people trying to hunt for where the postings are. So if you can change the location of the meeting, but it has to be done through a posting. And so if the postings are all for all these meetings, I don't know which public body you're on, sir, but if it's one that's under the county's umbrella, I would say that it's fine that it's posted at the county's regular site of posting. But if there's some last minute change, throw something up on the door, especially if you cancel a meeting, so that people aren't wondering what's going on. But I think if an ideal situation is both. But if it's not available here, because everybody knows there's one, you have like one central bank for these postings, you know, that's fine. There's no legal reason that that won't hold up. But I think just practically speaking, especially if you're changing a meeting at the last minute, so people aren't mulling about in the parking lot wondering what's going on, is if somebody can throw something up on the door. Okay. All right. We talked about best practices for public comment. Closed sessions, everybody's favorite. So closed sessions are very useful, but they're very limited. And if you don't know exactly the basis for your closed session, you should ask. Because these things are particular and they can really get you in trouble. Closed sessions is one of the few things that I can't fix by just saying, okay, just release the closed session minutes. You cannot, even if you do it improperly, you have to reenact the entire discussion from the closed session at your next board meeting. There's no oopsie, we went into closed session the wrong way, but we don't want to talk about it again. If you didn't go in under a legal basis, you got to have that discussion over, or you subject yourself to a potential violation of the Open Meetings Act. So no, state the basis. You have to say the reason you're going into closed session. You don't have to be specific. I use the one for attorney-client privilege, which falls under material exempt from disclosure under state law. It's a really broad topic. I know the citation, but we always just say attorney-client privilege, written legal opinion from Cohl, Stoker, and Toskey. We do not say what it's about. And that should be in the motion for the closed session. Ideally, you will cite to that exemption under the act, which is 15268H. I usually provide that. You don't have to get that rigorous with it, but you better say the magic words which support the basis you went into it. We're going to go in and discuss negotiations connected to collective bargaining. If you have collective bargaining minutes, we're going to go in to discuss the purchase of real property. You can't go in to talk about the sale of real property, which is insane in my mind that they just decided to pick one half of the transaction from the other. But you can only talk about the purchase up until the time you got an option or a purchase agreement approved. So it's only to cover that brief period of time where there's the potential for somebody else to swoop in and buy the piece of property out from under you. I'll go through the property one because I think it's important. I'm going to keep picking on Tim. So Tim is the county's representative. The county is interested in buying a piece of property. Don't want the public knowing where it is or what it is. The board goes into closed session to discuss the purchase of real estate. They cite to the Open Meetings Act, consider the purchase or lease of real property, and they enter closed session and they take the vote. They have a discussion in closed session. You cannot vote in closed session. So any formal action from the closed session has to happen when you come out. But that doesn't mean you can't gain consensus and get people's general authorization for him to proceed. And so the way that would work in this hypothetical is Tim says, are you interested in us purchasing this piece of property? We're in closed session. There's a separate set of minutes. Yeah, I'd like to hear it. And so he gives through, here's what I think a reasonable cost would be. I suggest that we enter into a letter of intent subject to board ratification prior to entering into a purchase agreement. We'll do our environmental due diligence. And I recommend that you have me act as the spokesperson on behalf of the county for that. And then my hope is that he either says, does anybody object to that? And if there's more than, let's take our 5-member board, 2 people who object to it, let's say 3 people object to it, well, let's keep talking about it then. But if nobody objects to it, he can say, okay, I'm gonna operate on that understanding, knowing that whatever we agree to will come back and be subject to your approval. You don't have to take a motion out of that closed session. He's got his marching orders, but the board still controls the purchase. He can't bind the county to the purchase until they have either delegated that to him by a motion or resolution saying, we approve the purchase agreement for XYZ property. But to get to that step, you're allowed to go in and talk about it in a closed session. That distinction is lost on most people who've never gone through and had the bad experience of having a property transaction contested because they talked about it all the way through in closed session. You got a real firm line as soon as that purchase agreement is approved. You can no longer discuss that piece of property if you have a signed purchase agreement in closed session.
So if they make the deal for him to do the take care of it and handle it and look into it, nobody talks about it after that. And he's approved to do everything up to the purchase without getting a motion or resolution.
Correct.
Okay.
So the way that it has to work, because only in our hypothetical, the public body can bind the county. They can delegate to somebody else to do the binding, but they have to make a formal action to do that or have a pre-approved policy. I haven't seen this before, but you could potentially have a property acquisition policy that allowed a county administrator to buy property up to $500,000, just like a blanket authorization. That'd be highly unusual, theoretically possible, but barring that, every property transaction should have a motion or resolution authorizing it and saying who gets to bind the county to sign it. Yeah, it should be very deliberate.
I have a question to ask. You said you could have closed session to do negotiating with the union, right? Can you have closed session with your governing body if you want to discuss a contract and that will apply?
No, so collective bargaining is the exemption for that. There is no provision for there to be a discussion regarding just a general employment contract.
Okay,
You can get around that. So all of these, the big sort of blanket one is ask for legal opinion. And then we can go into closed session. If you get a written attorney-client legal opinion, you don't even have to have your lawyer there if you don't like them. They can just send it to you via email. You can talk about it without them. And that's it. That's a really good way. Let's say the real estate deal goes sideways halfway through. It's hot. It's got environmental contamination all over it. You don't necessarily want to make that publicly known. Ask for a legal opinion regarding potential environmental liability. Okay, there you go. So there's a lot of ways to get at this, but it just needs to be done very deliberately and within the confines of the law. There's a different one here to discuss pending litigation with your attorneys. That's not the same as an attorney-client privilege written legal opinion. So if you want to discuss pending litigation, there actually has to be a case. I need a case number that is in the motion or a name, Jackson v. whoever. And then there doesn't need to be anything in writing, but then the public body can go into closed session as long as there's some detrimental financial effect. You'd be surprised, like a lot of people will sue for an injunction. Well, I would argue that's still a detrimental financial effect if you're going to defend it because you have to spend legal fees. They're not asking for money damages. They're just asking you to stop doing something. So there's just a lot of nuance in this. It's one of those things where obviously if you're dealing with an attorney, your legal attorney, your insurance defense counsel, they may not be experts in the Open Meetings Act. So you may want to point out, hey, we can't talk about pre-suit settlement because it hasn't been filed unless you give us a written attorney-client privilege legal opinion. And,
I see.
you can see, I started off this saying it's a trap for the unaware. The closed session section of this is the most compelling example. All right. So we've got the ability to review and consider the contents of an application for employment or appointment to a public office if the candidate requests that the application remain confidential. So if you've got a position that reports to your board, you can review all the applications in closed session, just get an email or something confirming that that person wants to be confidential. That makes a lot of sense, right? They may want to maintain their other job regardless if you're going to offer them a job, so they get a little confidentiality. But interviews of the public body or the actual appointment has to be done in an open meeting. You can't interview people confidentially. That is missed a lot, where you're having all these interviews. The workaround there is you delegate to a non-public body the interviews. You know, in the situation, I'm going to pick on Tim again, where if there's a board report, let's say it's me, legal counsel, I report directly to the Board of Commissioners. And Tim could go through with another, let's take another elected official and interview everybody and screen them. And that does not have to be posted because he's not a public body. So there's workarounds, things like that. Just know that if you're doing interviews in a closed session, you should probably ask how we're getting that done. And the answer probably won't be right.
So he can, that's okay because he's not a public body, even though he works for a public body?
That's right. Only members. All this stuff only applies. He's not elected. He is not a member of the Ogemaw County Board of Commissioners. He's a public official in his capacity, but he's not a member of the public body. That's a really, really important distinction. I'm glad you asked that. And it's not really obvious, right? I mean, you think, well, we're all in this together. He reports to the board. He needs to make sure that Open Meetings Act violations aren't happening within the public body, but he can't be, responsible for one. And that's why he can email everybody and say, here's what I recommend. And he's not, he could touch off deliberation amongst the members of the public body, but he's not counting towards a quorum. So he can't be subject to the act.
That's only members who count towards the quorum, so the clerk would be different, would not be the governing body, the deputy clerk.
Correct. Yep.
And as far as you said, to go over applications, if a committee goes over applications and then goes to the council or trustees, can they go into closed session to discuss those if the candidates say
Yep.
it needs to be confidential?
Absolutely. As long as we're specifically following under one of these, I think there's 8 articulated reasons, and this will blow your mind. Some of them require a 2/3 vote and some of them are a simple majority. It makes 0 sense to me why they've done that. They just thought that some were a little more serious than others. I have no idea. I would operate under, assume that they all require a 2/3 of, and it's members elected and serving. And so that's for County Board of Commissioners. On your public body, just 2/3 of the people there, if you're not subject to the, counties are very statutorily driven. Every other, if you're on a township or something else, just make sure that you understand what your governing documents say as far as the vote requirements go. The Open Meetings Act will still require a 2/3 vote, but it just may not count if people are absent. They may not count towards the 2/3. So if you had, for instance, 7 people on the board, 5 of them present, you're operating at a township level, you may be able to get into that closed session if you get 4 out of 5, which normally wouldn't be 2/3 of 7. It's a little pedantic, I know. You'd be surprised how often I'm trying to divide 4 into 7 to see if it's 60.66. But you end up looking at those things very closely when you're dealing with this area of the law.
What if you have a governing body of 5? Is it still 4 out
Yep.
of 5?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, let's run the math. I had to do this the other day at your meeting. So exactly, there's no rounding up. 3 divided by 5 is 60%.
I know that.
I need 66.
No, I know that.
Yeah, no, I don't. I mean, lawyers don't do math. This is why we check this stuff all the time. We only keep track of things in 10th of the hour increments, so we're not relying on the math rates.
So under, you talked earlier about if a committee within a board, for example, is reviewing applications, they can't come up and say, here's the person we recommend because they've got to present all the applications they had discussed.
It depends. If their committee meeting was posted and then they went into closed session under this exclusion under the Open Meetings Act, they could then take those recommendations and present them in closed session for the public body. You'd just be linking them. But if that committee was narrowing things down and it wasn't at an open meeting and they were a public body, let's say it was only comprised of, let's take the 5, it's pretty easy to take the 5 example, 5 people on the public body, you put together a application screening committee of 3 people and they eliminate half of the options. They should have been doing that at a posted meeting, even though they could have gone into closed session.
But if Tim's given that delegation, he can eliminate those and no issue. He just says, here's the 2 I think you should interview.
That's right.
Except that's usually followed up at the board meeting of, why did you eliminate this one?
Be prepared to talk about everything.
So negotiations with the union, if you have a body of 5, you only need 3 of the 5 to go into closed session. Is that correct? Is that what you said earlier?
So you're not negotiating with the union in closed session. What you're doing is you're getting your side of the plan together. So it's to discuss collective bargaining. And what you're doing there is you're developing the parameters for your negotiators in closed session so that the other side of the table, in this hypothetical, the union, doesn't know that you're going to offer 4%, but I'm going to start at 2. And so that way we can have a really robust conversation about the direction and authority without it being released.
And that's only in collective bargaining.
That's one of the examples, right? It also applies to grievance settlements. So that's considered that's a collectively bargained right. So if we had a grievance that was appealed, and I'm sorry, I don't know if yours has an appeal to the board or not, but if those contracts said at step 4, the County Board of Commissioners gets to rule on a grievance appeal for this contract X, Y, or Z, we could have a discussion in closed session about the grievance without the union and without the grievant. And then come back, hear from the union, hear from the grievant, and do our little hearing. So it's interesting. It's one of those things where we just have to know. We just have to know, because
It
you're,
feels like putting thread through a small
Exactly.
hole of a needle.
that's all it is. That's 100% of what this is. And this is a 5-page law. How long have we been talking about this so far? It shouldn't be this complicated, but it is. And, you know, this was written by a bunch of people who thought they knew better than all of us on what to do. And, you know, one amendment added 1.5 pages to this about COVID-19. It's no longer relevant. So it's just, this stuff is just kind of on the move. And it does have a pretty robust history now because it's been around since 1996. But a lot of this stuff, we have to rely on other cases, published opinions. You know, did this thing actually violate the Open Meetings Act? Because it's not just super obvious in the black letter of the law. All right.
So when we go into public or into a closed session, we have to announce the MCL
I recommend you do. You better be able to identify the basis.
with the letter and everything.
So if you see a motion and it's got it in there, it probably came from me because that's my preference. But if you say to discuss collective strategy connected to collective bargaining and you don't cite the MCL, you're covered. But I like to link them up because I don't want there to be any wiggle room about why we did it. Because all you have to do is misplace one word. We want to talk about a contract. And then we go into closed session. We didn't say it had to do with collective bargaining. So it's just one of those things where that's an area where I would encourage you to be very deliberate when you're citing to the basis.
Yeah, because before you guys came on, we got hit by the newspaper because we said the wrong letter.
Yeah, if you say the right description and the wrong letter, I don't care, that's okay. But if you don't say any description and you got the wrong letter, that's a problem. And so that's why I always do both. I mean, it's a little pedantic, but there's a sentence there that I provide as a draft motion. A lot of clerks know what they are too. It doesn't have to come from legal counsel. You don't have to have lawyers. You can just read the act. And you can say to this, and it can be long-winded, to consider material exempt from disclosure or discussion by state or federal statute. And my preference, MCL 15.268H. And my super preference is not even to say material exempt, but to say written attorney-client privilege legal opinion, because we know that works and it's always going to work. So that's all we're trying to do. We're just trying to eliminate scrutiny for getting challenged. It's basically what this area of the law is about, is being able to prove you went in there on a legally justified basis to have your, and here's the key, we haven't gotten to this yet, exclusively confidential discussion. It's confidential to the people in the closed session, and it is to remain confidential unless or until the board takes public action on the topic. And so what that means hypothetically is if we're talking about something in an attorney-client privileged legal opinion, not only is it privileged, so that really shouldn't be released unless the body votes to release it, but everybody in that discussion shouldn't be talking about it with people who weren't there unless the board has taken final action already. Because once you come out, let's take the purchase of property thing. There could be a month between the time you've authorized somebody to start negotiating I'll call it a non-binding letter of intent, and by the time you're executing a purchase agreement. That's a long time. And the law requires confidentiality during that period of time. But once you've approved the purchase agreement, okay, that's done in an open meeting. We know the address, we know the property, we know the purchase price, we know the due diligence that we're doing. It's all set out in there. I still don't want you to say, well, Tim told us this in the closed session. That's not really appropriate, but it's now publicly out there what is going on and what's happening. And that's why this stuff is here. It's not designed to dupe people. It's designed to allow the county to operate, or whatever your public body is. I keep picking on the county, whatever your public body is to operate. They figured out that in order to do business at the level that you're doing business with, some of this stuff has to remain confidential. And the minutes of a closed session remain confidential forever. They're never disclosed unless by court order. The law allows you to destroy them a year and a day after they're approved.
Yep.
A lot of places never approve their closed session minutes. You should be approving your closed session minutes as a separate document at your next regular board meeting. And that way the clock starts. I've got clients who've got closed session minutes that are 25 years old. Okay, they can't be disclosed. They're not subject to FOIA. I guess they could get disclosed through a court order if somebody had an old lawsuit. But as long as you're not destroying something that there's a litigation hold on, and by that I mean you got a notice from a lawyer saying anything and everything having to do with this car accident needs to be maintained. I would, if there was a closed session about the car accident, you shouldn't destroy that because you got notice that it could be subject to a court order. Other than that, I would have a regular disposal schedule of those because they can't be used. And it's, other than having somebody who was in the closed session come back and say, hey, I want to see what happened and what was said. And frankly, if even somebody wasn't, I've given advice that if a member of the public body wants to go back and look at a closed session that happened 5 years ago because the issues come back up, I think they have access to it because they control those records and they're a member of the public body. Now, if the county administrator who wasn't there and wasn't in the closed session asked for it, I'd say no, unless you get authority from a commissioner. That's not what the law says. So it's so complicated. I told you at the beginning, you're not supposed to memorize any of this. The only thing I'm trying to accomplish is make you just a little nervous next time somebody says, I move, we go into closed session. That's it. Make sure at that point, somebody's checked and that they have the basis and you know the votes, and then you know what you're supposed to do when you're in there. When you're in there, you're not voting to approve a purchase agreement. That has to be done in open session. All votes in an open session.
What's the penalty for the
Depends.
one that talks?
Most of the time it's a censure or a slap on the wrist because it doesn't go too far. But if somebody talks and somebody files a complaint, talking can be turned into hard to verify, right? But let's say you put it in an email or you release
Put
it
it on Facebook.
or released it to
How
the
I
media.
voted.
Yep.
Or what my opinion was.
You could technically file a complaint under the Open Meetings Act, and that could go to the prosecutor, state police, local sheriff, and it could be investigated, and that person could be subject to a potential misdemeanor violation under criminal code for intentional violation of the Open Meetings Act.
I don't even use that.
So it's serious business. It's just rare. Yeah. Yep, it's rare. All right, so we talked about the minutes. We talked about them being destroyed. Any final action has to be done. The decision has to be made in the open session.
Yeah.
But that can be pretty vague. So let's say we've gone in there and talked about a lawsuit and we've said, we recommend settlement of this for $250,000. You can come out of there and say, I move we accept the recommendation of our attorney regarding case number blank. I've got what I need because I have to trust my client's not going to change their mind on me in a week. But you don't have to disclose because you may say up to 250,000. I may be able to get it done for 50. And so it's really important, especially things like that, whether it's bargaining, anything, that stuff remain confidential. And then what's going to happen is you're going to approve that settlement at some point in an open meeting when it's all signed off. And you're going to authorize the board chair or whoever to sign the settlement document. So it all gets there. Like it's just steps. It's steps in the progress that you're allowed to do these things and keep them confidential until the thing is done.
Well, okay, so in that example you just gave, the vote or the motion to be up, we in public session, you say we approve or give our attorney up to 250? No,
I wouldn't do that.
Okay, right, okay, that's what I was gonna say.
I would say, I move we accept the recommendation of our attorney.
Okay, but you said you could add on there up to 250.
That's in the closed session discussion.
Okay, I missed that. Okay.
Sorry, thank you for the clarification. So the closed session will probably go something like this. This person did a bad thing. We are on the hook for potentially $2 million. Here's the range of reasonable settlement. Would you approve up to 250,000? And I look for head nods. Are there any questions? And then I say, does anybody object to this? And as long as less than a majority don't object to it, I mean, it's kind of like silence is consent, right? So if there's no statement to that they object, then I'm moving forward with that. But at the same time, I would like there to be confirmation, because I know what my recommendation was. I probably put it in writing to you, that you've accepted my recommendation. And that way I'm not on the hook for doing something where people are saying, you're gonna give me $250,000. And, you know.
Well, you would hope that would be in the notes of the closed meeting too.
Yeah, that could be helpful, but that doesn't really help my malpractice carrier because they can't get that. So I want to make sure that those things are orderly while maintaining confidentiality. But I will tell you that when we're doing collective bargaining, I rarely, if ever, unless the contract's done, if we're not voting on a ratification, there's almost never a motion coming out of that closed session to discuss strategy for collective bargaining. Because you're just giving me, here's the playing field. And then I better take some good notes. And then I better hope by the time I bring it back to you, you haven't changed your mind. But that's the nature of the relationship. You know, you have to be able to trust the people you're delegating to do what you want them to do, especially in collective bargaining. If you have any experience there, the needle tends to move. I mean, even after I've gotten authorization, we may start talking about something else. We come back, talk about it again. Depending where we're at in the process, beginning, middle, or end, you may have a very different perspective. And so it's really important that those closed sessions stay current. But at the same time, I don't want you coming out of closed session and saying, you can do a wage increase up to 2.5%, especially if I'm just getting something across the table that said 1. Yeah. But, you know, that's the advantage for that one. So the collective bargaining makes sense.
If you were to, not to jump back, but it would be the same if you were discussing termination or discipline with an employee. Would that person have to request that you would enter into closed session to discuss it?
Yep. Caveat, unless it's attorney-client privilege communication. So the board can ask, hey, what are the parameters for this? What's our risk exposure? What are these different things? That's just that's the catch-all. But you're right that you cannot discuss a periodic performance review, discipline, or termination of an employee from that unless that person requests a closed session. I'm just telling you there's another avenue in.
Okay.
All right. Talked about the minutes. Oh, I think it's a good idea. And I know I have some people who take minutes to read back those minutes in the closed session. That way, basically, you could approve them as soon as you come out, or you do them at the next meeting. But, you know, making sure that I really don't like verbatim minutes of a closed session. Topic, discussion ensued, you know, left the closed session. It's a little wonky leaving a closed session. So the AG's office has said you can vote to leave a closed session. That's just operational procedural. It's not a true vote on a matter of public policy. I still advise boards, just to avoid questions, to vote to return to open session after you've let the public back in. And that way it's documented in the open meeting. So the vote to go in is an open meeting. It makes sense to me to have a vote to return in the open meeting. It seems a little cumbersome. It's not really required. You could just say the chair in the closed session could confirm that we're done and say, without objection, we'll return to the open session. And that wouldn't be reflected in the minutes. It would just say board returned to open session at 6:15. So there's a few ways to do it. I just recommend that there be something, whether it's done in closed session or an open, that is documented somewhere that we stopped talking in the closed session and started talking in the open session again. Seems pretty self-evident, but you'd be surprised how many times a closed session at the end of the meeting ends the meeting. You can't adjourn a meeting from a closed session. So you got to come back, even if it's for 15 seconds and, without objection, we're adjourned. In a lot of places, they'll tell the public, hey, we're not going to take any action after this closed session. So people don't have to sit around if it's a 2-hour dissertation on a property purchase that they're not going to find out about that night. But you got to come back into the open session at some point. Okay. We talked about agendas, participation by video or phone. This gives a history of the amendments. Just know right now that, it's to vote to be counted toward a quorum or to deliberate toward a decision in that process. And I carved out, which logically makes sense to me, if you want to let somebody comment, if they're not voting and you're interested in their 2 cents, I don't think that's barred by this. None of this has been tested. I mean, we just are interpreting what this amendment that was thrown together in, 2 weeks means. But nobody's tested this. Just know that if you're voting and counting toward a quorum, you better be on active military duty. Otherwise, you got to be physically present. That's the status of the law right now. That doesn't mean you can't broadcast your meetings. Obviously, a lot of people are doing broadcasts. You can allow public comment via Zoom. Members of the public, staff, legal counsel. I mean, when I come to your meetings, I'm always on Zoom. So that's not a problem. I'm not a member of the public body. And I think that, this makes a lot of sense to operate this way. For me, logistically, it'd be literally impossible for me to be at all the meetings that I'm at if I didn't have the opportunity to attend electronically. But there's nothing that says you have to broadcast over Zoom. But to me, the cat's out of the bag. I mean, most places figured out how to do it over the last 2 years. You don't have to keep doing it, but I think at certain levels, the county level is one where you were doing it. It's expected.
Yeah, we still do it.
Yep. And I don't think, at least in my experience here in Ogemaw County, you don't get 20 people commenting. You might over Zoom.
Sometimes we get 20 people listening, but.
Yeah, right. So it's just another way that facilitates and encourages access, but just know it's not legally required to broadcast your meetings. So here's the enforcement piece. We kind of hit on it already. A lot of it has to do with public access. A lot of it has to do with transparency. If a public body is not complying with the act, any person may commence a civil action against a public body to invalidate a decision. So you see circuit court actions. And circuit court actions can include an award of attorney fees if they're successful. The way that we address most circuit court actions is that we reenact it. Even if it's not an admission that you did it wrong, but what you're doing is you're basically giving the lawsuit a poison pill because now you've redone it in a way that is unimpeachable because it was done in an open session. We don't have to dicker and deal about whether or not the closed session was proper or improper if we have the same discussion again in open session. A public official who intentionally violates the act. So that's the key, intent. This is criminal law stuff. Did you mean to? Intentionally violate the act is guilty of a misdemeanor. In addition, a public official who intentionally violates the act is held personally liable in a civil action for actual and exemplary damages, not more than $500 per meeting, as well as court costs and actual attorney fees. There's not a whole lot that attaches personal liability to your work on a public body. You are covered by governmental immunity unless you are grossly negligent. This and FOIA are kind of the two areas of the law where you can get caught up in this. And FOIA, the example is, you said you didn't have it, and then when they subpoenaed Verizon, it's all there, and you didn't produce it. That's on you. So this stuff they're separate but related. These are the things that if I'm on a public body, I want to make sure I don't get sideways with. You're already doing something that's a big time, energy, and effort commitment. Don't expose yourself to personal liability. And so these two areas of the law are ones that, I just want you to have a healthy respect for, maybe a tiny bit of fear when it comes to closed sessions, and just verify that you're doing it in a way that it needs to be done under this law, and you'll be fine. I think that, in my experience, 99% of people who serve on a public body, even if they're doing it wrong, don't get an Open Meetings Act complaint filed against them. it's rare, but once it happens, it's usually pretty transformative. It really changes the way that people conduct themselves and do business. And it's just one of these things where that's okay. I mean, that's why we have laws, right? To reform behavior. But my preference is you never experience that because it's not pleasant, and that you do it right, because that's the public's expectation in this area, that they know what's happening. It's what it's all about. So that's my spiel.
What about you talked about the organizations you've seen, the pre-meetings,
Yeah.
little pre-meetings. This is not so much on the
Don't
county.
do it.
Yeah, not on the county side, but sometimes smaller
Pre-meetings,
groups, a lot of times, where they don't get much public participation.
yeah, the pre-meetings count. You know, if we wanted to go through the mental exercise of saying, well, we fixed our Open Meetings Act violation by reenacting it all later in the day, you know, may or may not be defensible. How do I prove that everything you talked about at breakfast, you talked about again at the board meeting? Because that's literally the standard. If you've had a meeting that violates the Open Meetings Act, the only remedy is reenactment. And I just wouldn't do it. I just think that it is a trap, and it happens. I know it happens. I'm not naive enough to think it doesn't happen. It's just one of those things where don't bother. Talk about something else. I mean, it's just like everything. You get together with your colleagues, you're going to talk about your work. But the key is either keep it high level where you're not talking about anything specific, like, hey, we should probably bring this up at some point at a meeting, and then move on. But, you know, one-on-one, always fine. 5 of you together, sitting at the local watering hole at 5 o'clock on the night before your next board meeting. And then you take action with very little discussion on something controversial. That's the one that's going to get you. That's the one I see. There's a case out of Marquette County where they, I can't remember if it was their legal counsel or county administrator, but they let them go without any discussion. And there was just a motion and a vote. Ottawa County is experiencing this right now on some things that they did at the beginning of the year. And the question people have is, how did they know they had the votes? And maybe they didn't. Maybe somebody just risked it and winged it. I don't know. But that's when the digging starts. And then you start getting FOIAs, and then you start getting interviewed, and then you start getting police. And then all of a sudden, one person starts talking, oh yeah, we meet every Tuesday at 5 o'clock and talk about everything.
Well,
Oh boy.
I've been to a township meeting where I've heard a trustee say, well, I'll just wait till we have our little meeting.
Yeah.
Oh, really? Really?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So, yeah, you know, yeah, I'm sitting there questioning, oh, wait a minute, what are you doing? What are you doing here, your little meeting?
And I think
It's not
that,
breakfast.
exactly.
We're just talking about things. It's a planned meeting.
I think that in those
What about
cases.
lunch?
Yeah.
Well, lunch.
Well, that's different.
That's what I thought. Lunch would be different.
Any of those situations, I think, as
Even if you have it at 10 o'clock at night.
a courtesy, it should be raised as a potential issue so they can look into it. I mean, I'm not going to encourage you to go around and file, you know, allegations of Open Meetings Act violations, because that wouldn't be responsible of me to do. What I'd encourage you to do is say, hey, have you looked into this, whether or not it's a meeting under the Open Meetings Act? Plant the seed. I think there's a ton of benefit to that sort of courtesy and self-policing. If you get an email going, and I see it, I'm on these emails. Oftentimes, if it's not me, somebody will say, hey, we shouldn't be having back and forth in the email. Just a gentle nudge, you know, just try to remind people. It happens both ways. It happens to new people, and it happens to people who've been on a board for a long time. There's a comfort in whatever the status quo was, and the communication styles and all these other things. And the comfort can get you in trouble because you can say, well, we've always done it this way. We've always had this meeting. Nobody's ever had a problem
I
with it.
used to hear that.
That's true. And that may go on infinitum until that one day and that one motion and that one thing that wasn't discussed openly.
And a lot of this is that technology, now that we can text and email, you know, you think that it's harmless to do that, but yet if I text one commissioner and they text another,
Well, that's okay.
now there's 3 of us.
But That's one-to-one. I mean, it's literally linking them up. If you're all on the same text
But
stream, yeah,
if I ask that other commissioner, will you text the other one and ask him what he thinks?
yeah, all of a sudden you could be doing a round robin.
Yeah.
But look, I've accomplished my goal. You're thinking about it. That's it. Just think about it.
Oh, yeah.
He's not gonna sleep tonight.
Unpacking all, delete all the text messages.
But you can send one like, I need to talk to you. And oftentimes it's getting an opinion of some sort. You know, I think, I don't understand this.
One-on-one.
I think I need an opinion.
You can do that, absolutely. And you can even go further than that. You know, what would you do if we're presented with this question? You can pose those hypotheticals. You can have those discussions one-on-one.
All right,
You can go around and have that discussion 5 times.
yeah, because sometimes you say, I need to talk to you, and then I'll say, you know, I don't understand this. I think we need to get an opinion on this.
Yep.
That's fair, right?
Yep.
Okay,
But it's best to do it
I'm not guilty.
over the phone or in person, not put it in writing.
That's what I said.
This is my attorney here.
Sharp group. It's a sharp group. I like this.
That's right.
Are there any other questions? Doesn't even have to be limited to the Open Meetings Act. We can do a little free for all here for a minute if you want.
If you could expand for a couple more minutes, we get into the next 10.
Okay. This is all covered under their retainer. It's fine. Don't worry about it. I like this. Do you guys need legal counsel? You know, expand the work a little bit.
So I got a question, back to the public comment. Is it optional to have 2 or you just have to have 1, right?
Legally required to have 1. And if you only have 1, it shouldn't be limited at all. You can have 2 and you could say, look, we want comment on just agenda topics on the first one, and then we open it up to everything.
Right.
I see a lot of board rules that say relevant and germane to county business, for example. You can probably get away with that. I wouldn't want that case though, to be honest, because public comment, I mean, if somebody thinks it's really important for you to know about, you know, not every county has a separate road commission. You do, is that if they want you to know about these potholes, even though it has nothing to do with your jurisdiction, I would let them tell you.
Yeah.
And that's just how I operate with public comment. I've seen some crazy ones. I got ones coming in telling me, you know, about chickens or whatever. It doesn't matter. Let that play out. Let that play out.
I haven't had people in the media, not in the media, but in the public, stop me in like potholes, for instance. You know, you need to help me. We got all these potholes. What can you do? And I think, well, you really talk to the road commission.
Perfect.
Yeah, but
You've done what.
I know, but they still want me to talk to them.
Yeah.
Also.
Yeah, and that's more of your role as a representative, but as far as like, you know, a strict thing,
Like
public
being
comment.
happy.
Yeah, exactly. Public comment, if there's 1 or 2, you don't have to have the second one. I think a best practice is having 2. You'll find most people don't comment twice. And if they get there late and they missed it, you know, they can still say their piece at some point in the meeting. Are you guys getting, I mean, just to show of hands, is anybody with any regularity getting 30 minutes of public comment at your meetings?
No, all depends on the topic.
I know, with regularity. So in the last 6 months, have you had public comment go on for more than 30 minutes, more than 3 times?
No.
To get the gavel.
All right.
Get the gavel before it goes that far.
Next show of hands, have you had a meeting in the last 3 months where there was no public comment?
No.
Okay, so there was a mix. It was mixed up.
We have 2.
Yeah, my experience is, right, I'm not going to use this as a disparaging term, but some people think it is. There's certain gadflies that just come to meetings and want you to hear what they have to say every time. I respect that. I think that's excellent. A lot of those people end up on the board at some point. I don't have a problem with that. But my experience in seeing all this is that there's only a couple times and a couple of issues where you're going to have a meeting really get derailed by public comment. 99% of your meetings will be those 1 or 2, 0, or, you know, some variation in between. So I always err on the side of treat it the same every time. Everybody gets to speak their piece. You apply the same rules. If somebody gets to 3 minutes, I wouldn't immediately slam the gavel down and tell them they're done. Just
Oh, we do.
your 3 minutes are about up. Please wrap up your thought. Yep, it happens.
Is there a law?
Let her talk.
Sure, if we're moving that.
To say it is 3 minutes.
Yeah, so the law allows you to put reasonable rules in place. So they have to be approved by the public body. It should be part of your board rules on how you operate public comment. I don't think 30 seconds of public comment is reasonable, but it hasn't been tested. So most places allow 3 to 5 and maybe a second one that's either the same length or a little less. I would say that most of them are 3 minutes.
I have another question. I've had this happen to me before, and I know I'm not the only one. Before a county commissioner meeting, people stop you in the hallway. Like this and say, you need to change your vote. You know, and I just tell them, no, I've made my vote and I'm not changing it. You know, there's more to this than you even know. And I leave it at that. But I've had people stop me in the hallway, wanting me to change my vote from a previous meeting.
Heavy is the crown. There's a lot of responsibility in the role that you have.
Oh, I know, but my crown's not too heavy yet. It might be in a month, but it's
I
not right
think,
now.
you have to balance being responsive to your constituents, and then ultimately, you're the one who got elected. And so it's your judgment, and, you can change your mind, but I think other than being courteous and professional, you don't know that person anything.
Where are you with, or any of us, with, before a meeting takes place, but they know a vote's coming up and you get people calling you or stopping by and they want to talk to you about your position and what you think of it and how you're gonna vote?
Well,
communication.
yeah, I mean, there's no legal bar against it, but that's what it is, really. If you want to be available to people for their feedback, that's fine, or you can tell them, why don't you come to the meeting? We got an opportunity for public comment and you can let us know what you think. If it's a colleague on the board, I hear them out. If it's, people within the organization and you've got the time and wherewithal, fine. I mean, I think it's good to be responsive to your constituents, but at the same time, you don't own, 20 hours of your week.
Okay, but I mean, it planning commission, it's come up a few times, and our question is, should we even be discussing it with them as far as not in front of the whole board? Listening is fine, but
Yeah.
should we carry on the discussion and give some thoughts?
You can. I mean, they're not a member of the public body in your hypothetical, are they?
No,
Are they before you on an issue? Like, are they an applicant or are they somebody who's opposed to an issue?
they'd be opposed to it.
Yeah, I think with applicants, I mean, that's really when your example about ex parte, I would not be discussing with an applicant one-on-one how you're gonna vote until you're all together. If it's somebody who lives next door, I'd hear that person out just so that they know that you are accessible to them. That's a constituent issue to me. But you don't have to. And I think if you want to direct them to, look, why don't you come to the meeting? Why don't this is something, especially if they start in on it and you think it's something that the rest of the board or the body could benefit from, direct them there. But it's not your responsibility to convey their issues to the public body. If it's your issue, fine, you convey it. If you like their issue, that's up to you. You can convey it, but you have no responsibility for somebody calling you out of a meeting and saying, neighbor number 3 said this.
I think we have actually some language about the part of communication in our bylaws. So
Yeah.
both our commission and our.
It just gets messy and it subjects yourself to claims of bias. And that's why, as a policy, I think it makes a ton of sense, especially if it's somebody with a decision in front of you.
It's usually a contentious decision.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the reason why.
And I think you can also say to that person, look, we have a policy against this, especially if you think it's relevant, and then give them the step, which is come make your public comment. We're going to be discussing at this meeting. I'd end the conversation. Without being rude, if that's possible. Anything else? No? Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Good seeing you.
Very good.
Yeah. I'll remember your face next time. I was thinking, I've only seen you in person one time.
Yeah.
So I recognized your voice
As soon as you said that, I was like, oh my God, I'm so embarrassed. I'm sorry.